listening to Connections Radio, the sound of business. I'm Louisa Wizzi Magnussen with the business of joy and colour with J.Nichole Smith. J.Nichole Smith, also known as Nick, is a joy and colour expert and the founder of Joy First, a creative agency offering joy makeovers. An expert in design and colour psychology, she has spent nearly 20 years helping people create lives and brands that centre joy. Her work has featured in USA Today, Real Simple, and Condé Nast Traveler, and she joins me today to discuss the business of joy and colour. Welcome to Connections Radio, Nick, and thank you for joining me today. Could you please begin by introducing us to the idea of living with joy? What exactly are we talking about here?
I mean, I feel like there's 1,000 ways you can go with that, right? But for me, what it really comes down to is making decisions from a place of joy instead of a place of fear.
That's interesting because a lot of us we do get fearful, don't we humans? And so are you thinking joy can replace fear? And if so, how can we do that?
Well, I think ultimately there are some ways that you can train yourself into some more generally positive and optimistic thinking. There's a new sort of study in something called positive intelligence. You've probably heard of emotional intelligence, and this is sort of the next version on of that, where you can actually change the neural pathways of your brain so your default thinking is more optimistic. And that's not like a toxic positivity kind of thing. It's just creating new pathways where you default to the slightly more optimistic thought rather than the slightly more doom-filled thought.
That's interesting. We
But
know a bit about that on this show. Sorry to interrupt you. We know a
okay,
little bit about that. We've done the business of neuroscience, where we talked about how you
cool.
can
Yeah.
literally rewire your own brain. It's fascinating. And we've also done the business of
Yeah.
emotional intelligence with Rodney C. Burris, who is a White House consultant. He actually teaches the White House on emotional intelligence. So he was a cool guest. So this is bringing that further on. That's really interesting. Can you talk us through your career background? And how you came to
Yeah.
set
So
up Joy First, your agency.
my what I was going to say about the positive intelligence is that that's not really my jam. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not a doctor. But the other half of that is there's also some conscious decision making and some sort of a choice about how we live and what we do and don't do that we can sort of establish for ourselves. And my background actually is in marketing and branding. And throughout my career, which has been over 20 years now, there's a couple things that happened that were really interesting. One, I've started my own brands, and so I've been on all sides of the coin and really understood the whole idea of bringing something to market, selling it to people, and watching what happens when you have a good product versus a bad product versus one that just takes off like crazy. And the other thing is really, I've done a master's in marketing and understanding how much of what is sold to us is fear based. So
Mm.
much of what makes us buy and consume is based on feelings of not enoughness, on urgency, scarcity, these sort of external irrelevant pressures. And so as I've gone through, I've sort of gravitated towards building brands and marketing in a way that is much less around that fear-based stuff and much more around luxury, the good life, building relationships, and offering something positive. So that's kind of where I come to this conversation around joy is having such a deep insider information from the marketing side of things about fear, what it does to us, how powerful it is for our behavior, and coming from the other side of the argument around making a conscious choice to choose joy instead of being sucked into the fear paradigm.
Because they want us to be sucked in, don't they? The advertisers, the
Yes, they
marketers.
do.
They
Hmm.
want it's the way society, Western society at least, is kind of built. We are built on fear. I really
Yeah.
agree with you there. Tell me about the psychology of color. What's happening in the brain when we look at certain colors? Because that's the other topic today. It's color.
Yeah, and it's interesting because color sort of became an accidental specialism of mine. The deeper I got into building these brands that were feel good, the deeper my expertise grew in terms of color and how it affects us. And then I did a whole specialism in color psychology and what I call, well, I don't call it, it is called applied color psychology, which is the crossover between color psychology and personality types, which we can dive into in a second. But basically, color psychology is simply the way our brain and body perceive color and what it does once it gets into our brain and is perceived. So some of those perceptions will be physical, some will be emotional, some will be more mental. And there is a very predictable response through neurotypical brains. I haven't seen enough research yet on neurodivergent brains, and what it does. If you're ADHD, does your brain process it the same way? If you're autistic, does it process the same way?
Hmm.
And I think I've had a few interviews with people who have stopped seeing color when they've gotten very depressed. And so there are some really interesting, not very well studied sort of exceptions to this rule. But basically, what we're talking about is we see color, which is light. It comes in through our eyes, it gets interpreted by our brain, and then has some fairly predictable impacts on the way we think, feel, and behave.
And when you say that, do you mean certain colors will create certain emotions in a certain reaction, certain physical reactions? And is it the same for every person? For example, will I interact with yellow? Will I respond to yellow in the same way you will respond to yellow? Let's pretend I'm neurotypical because we haven't done the studies on neurodiverse. Yeah, is it the same for everybody?
Theoretically, yes, that's what the research says is that a quote unquote normal human brain everywhere in the world will go through the same process. This is the psychology. The psychology is unconscious. You probably don't realize it's happening. You might be able to sort of have an experience and recognize it where it then becomes conscious. But consciously, we have a lot of different feelings and interpretations of color. So obviously, there's a lot of cultural constructs around color. Red is lucky in some places and a totally different vibe in others.
I can't do red.
And yeah, a lot of people can't.
I
Yeah,
can do a
or
sort of rust red or a sort of maroon red, like the color of your jumper, for example. I really like that. The color of my top under here, I can't stand. It's the only one I had clean today. But I don't like red. It fills me with fear, red, and it makes me go, oh no, that's too strong. I don't like it.
that's so interesting. So you must be very sensitive to it. I just watched an interview with Martha Stewart the other day, and she also doesn't like red. And she talked about how if there anything popped up red in her garden, she would pull it out.
Yeah,
She's
I'm
just
the
like
same. I don't
not
do
a
red in my
fan.
garden, and I don't do red cars. I just don't do red.
It's very
Um,
stimulating. It's a very powerful color. Yeah.
yeah.
So we will also have personal associations. So if you had a uniform in school growing up that you hated, or the color of your bedroom that you loved, then we will obviously make personal connections. And for the longest time, scientists thought that, well, it's all subjective, right? Like everyone has their feelings about color, and there's no way that it could be consistent. But actually, starting in the 80s, we started to see that actually there is tremendous consistency and predictability with how color impacts us.
Mm. Let's talk more about your agency, Joy, first. What specific services do you offer, and how do you onboard clients?
Interesting. So, as this work grew for me personally, I created a methodology diving deeper into psychology, being able to make it easier for business owners to use a very specific psychologically driven framework to build a brand. So, I'm particularly focused on branding. That's what I've always done. But because I've also been a serial entrepreneur, I've never been the person who's like, let's go splash loads of cash on branding for fun. Like, I want to know the ROI, right? I want to know it's going to make it better. I want to know that making that change, especially if you have brand recognition, is actually going to be an improvement. We've seen so many examples of brands who have done a rebrand for the fun of it, like The Gap and loads of others, where you're just like, what have you done? And they've had to backtrack because
Yeah.
it felt like they were just doing it to create change and not necessarily a clear vision of how to make it better. So
Doing
I
it because
went
those corporate
searching.
budgets are too high.
Yeah, right. Everyone's busy trying to provide more symbolism and meaning and get more market share. Um, so as we developed and tested this framework, what we found is that when you use a few simple tools like color psychology, like archetypes, you can create tremendous psychological consistency, which is what has the biggest impact on your instant trust, credibility, and the things that move the needle in terms of conversions and trust, especially online where you have so much less time than you do in person. So at Joy First, what we do is we use that methodology. I call it the color brand method. And we help small businesses, big businesses, market leaders, there's a whole range, basically build brands that are psychologically consistent. And you asked about onboarding. Typically, we have an application process for most of what we do to make sure people are a good fit. But ultimately, the people who work with us are sort of what I would call joy-centered companies where they're interested in making a positive difference. They're interested in having a brand that feels good and is kind to people, and they're willing to be that kind of organization as well, not just make it a marketing campaign.
I like that. Why is joy an important part of life? Might sound like a stupid question, but let's go there.
It's one of my favorite questions. So, I'm working on a book right now called Joy First, which is sort of addressing this exact question. And in the beginning, we're making an argument for why joy? Why does it matter? Who cares? Because obviously, as you mentioned, our culture doesn't necessarily make it easy to prioritize it.
Or promote it.
And promote it. Yeah, we are not in any way incentivized to pursue joy as a job, as a pastime, as a valid use of our time and energy. And in many cases, we actually feel like we have to earn it, which is wild, right? Because
And we
it's a
feel
birthright.
guilty when we experience it as well. And we're like really happy and joyful.
Sometimes,
I sometimes catch myself going, oh God, everything's going too well. It's going to go wrong soon. There's that
yeah.
fear that comes in, even when you are experiencing joy. Sometimes it gets interrupted with that feeling of, oh my God, what's going to go wrong? Like it's not going to last. That's how fearful we are.
100%. And also the thing that we've seen for the last couple of years and probably beyond, but I've really been paying attention the last couple of years is that we feel a tremendous amount of guilt for feeling joy when there's really dark stuff happening in the world. And it's
Mm.
hard for us to sometimes separate like how sad or scared or stressed we feel about things we don't have control over and the joy and pleasure in our own life. And sometimes if we really care about a cause or a group of people or something that's happening politically, we struggle to either allow the joy or allow ourselves to experience it when it does happen. And the bottom line is there's tons of science and tons of studies that say this, but joy is one of the most fundamentally important parts of our well-being. Mentally, physically, emotionally, across the board, it is good for us in just about every possible way you can measure. And that's the case that I'm making in the book. And also, wouldn't you rather live a life that feels more like joy than fear? I mean, bottom line, right? And
Yeah.
it's contagious. So if we're doing it for ourselves, which is kind of the only thing we ultimately can control, it rubs off on other people and it creates these upward spirals of positivity, optimism, joy in everybody around you. So for me, I am kind of in the mission of like, my mission is to create a joy first world. And the way I see that happening is this sort of one at a time, sneaky little getting people to focus on joy for themselves and knowing that it's going to affect the 10, 20 people around them.
Mm.
And together, that's how we get it done.
Yeah, like the ripple effect, right? When you start a little tiny ripple, it can go on and on and on, and it's all energy at the end of the day, isn't it, really? And if we're
Yeah.
projecting joyful energy, that is gonna impact other people, not everybody, because as you probably know, like I always smile at people down the street, right? Every human I interact with, I'm like, hello, and most people just kind of go, they don't smile back, but the ones that do, you're like, yes, I've spread joy today. It's a
You got to
really
move up north. Really friendly up here.
yeah, it's because I'm in Surrey. It's not very friendly in Surrey.
Yeah. I used to live in
Um,
Twickenham, so I know the
oh yeah,
sort
I
of
used to
West
work there.
London. Oh,
Yeah,
cool.
I
Yeah.
worked there for a while. My last corporate role,
Mm.
a few years ago before the pandemic. Um, so what is the most poignant thing you've learnt about joy in your 20-year career helping people find it in their own lives?
Ooh, that is such a good question. I think one of the most surprising things, which has had a big impact on my own life, is that oftentimes we conflate joy and happiness. They are different things, and the definitions are kind of geeky, but generally, the way I think about it is joy is happiness with more meaning and purpose, basically.
Mm.
But what is really interesting is people also conflate joy and pleasure. And when I start talking about joy first, one of the first reactions is, I got to get stuff done. Like, I got to be productive. I can't just be around like prioritizing joy all the time.
Haven't got time to be in a pink bubble going, yay!
Exactly. And so I think people have this fear that if they're focused on joy or making joy first decisions, that they will not be able to be productive members of society, which is what we are trained to be, first of all. Um, and that it'll be this sort of hedonistic bubble of lavish pleasure nonstop, right?
Sounds
But
great.
one of the, yeah, right, it does sound good. Doesn't sound very productive, but it sounds pretty fun.
Yeah.
But one of the most interesting things I've discovered in the research on joy is that comfort and joy, despite the Christmas song, like do not necessarily always go hand in hand. And while you often do need comfort for happiness, oftentimes what you need for joy is discomfort. Often you have to move through a period of discomfort for joy to be deeper, more profound, and more lasting. And so there is a very strong relationship between joy and discomfort. And I think one of the things that our society teaches us to be is comfortable all the time. And if we're uncomfortable, we're not safe and we need to fix it. And that is one of the things I'd love to see us get better at separating for ourselves and kind of abolishing. So, one of the things I'm really actively doing in my own life now is purposely allowing myself to be more uncomfortable more often without the urge to fix it.
Mm.
Because A, it makes you a nicer person to be around when you're not like, so particular and needing to be comfortable all the time. It makes you not so fun. But also, I know that that discomfort, and this is really interesting when you get into all the studies now around dopamine as well, and how we're getting so out of balance with dopamine, is that the discomfort usually brings more joy and makes joy more possible and more lasting. So it's an interesting sort of 180 on the lives that we've been building.
Yeah, I can relate to that because it's, for example, if you're hungry, if you're eating because it's lunchtime, it might be okay. You might shovel it down and then that's lunch done. But if you're really hungry, if you've been like fasting for the day or whatever, intermittently fasting, whatever, that like sandwich or bowl of soup is going to be so much more like, it's lovely. It's going to be so much more
Mm.
satisfying and it's going to be more of a joyful experience because you've been in discomfort.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned fasting because that's one of the examples I'm using in the book is this in the ways that we're changing. Also, like lots of people are doing a lot more like ultra marathons and
Mm.
extreme fitness and exercise things for the same reason. I think we're having to push ourselves farther in order to get that payoff.
And that's related to the dopamine reactions, isn't it? And what's going on
Yeah.
in the actual brain, the chemistry of the brain. We won't go too
Yeah.
far into that because neither of us are neuroscientists.
Yeah.
Where let's go back to color. Where does it come into our experience of joy itself? Is there power in a particular color that we interact with? Go on, what's the
Yes,
color?
and I'm gonna circle back to it. I'm gonna leave that loop open for a
Okay,
second.
lovely. Yeah.
Um, but one of the interesting things I mentioned before is this idea of applied color psychology. So if you go onto the internet and you Google color psychology, you're going to get loads of infographics of like these logos are blue and these ones are yellow and these ones are green and this is what these colors mean. And
Mm.
there's a couple really important missing pieces that make some of that information not necessarily wrong, but not completely true or not complete. And that's two primary sort of schools of thought. One of which is that what color blue are we talking about? Are we
There's
talking
so many
about
shades.
cyan, navy, like cornflower? Like what blue is supposed to be associated with trust? I don't know.
Mm.
Like, and it's not clear. And the logos included in the infographic are all over the map in terms of blue, right? So one piece of it is what color group what color are we talking about when we talk about blue? And there are four color groups. Briefly, what that means is there's yellow based and blue based colors, there's yellow based blues and blue based blues. I know that sounds a little crazy. And then if you break those groups down further, there are colors that are sort of intense and pure. And then there's colors that have had black or gray added, where they have some subdued stuff happening. And each one of those color groups has a very specific role. It has very clear sort of um, impact on us connected to the other colors in that group that are all a little bit subdued with gray or that are all very clear and bright and warm or cold. So that's one piece. The other piece is personality type. I've been studying positive psychology for a long time. And one of the things that has always frustrated me about all the books about happiness and how we get happy, stay happy, find happiness as human beings is that there's so much in the search for the soundbite, there's so much one size fits all information, right? If you just journal, if you just meditate, if you just do this and you just do that, you'll be happy just like everybody else.
That
But
lovely
as
word,
we all
just.
know, right?
Mm.
As we all know, A, that's harder than it sounds, and B, we are all different. And I don't even mean, I am not neurotypical, so I don't even mean like neurotypical, we're all the same, but like we have different personality traits, we have different needs, we have different preferences above all. And if you break all people down into four personality types, which is the sort of the very boilerplate version of Carl Jung's personality types. A lot of other stuff has been built on. The research says, and this is where it gets geeky and fun, and this is applied color psychology, that each one of those four groups has a strong preference for each one of those four groups of color. And so you can create color harmony for this person with this group of color, but it's not just about color either. It's about our preferences for loads of things. And so for me, that's the starting point for just about everything is finding fit first.
It's fascinating. How can we create a joyful life? What are your top joy-centered tips?
Well, I'll circle back to the color question and let you know that the color of joy is one that is often not very popular with a lot of people, and it is orange. So there's obviously every color has a spectrum. So there's, often both positive and negative psychological impacts, except for one color, which doesn't have any positive. I'll tell you about that in a second. And so joy can be in fun and play and abundance, and joy in quite a potentially quite a grounded way. So the sort of like the color I'm wearing is sort of a burnt orange and it gets quite grounded and a little bit earthy. And
It's one
that's
of
where
my
we have a lot
absolute
of,
favorites.
well, now you know
I've got a
why.
suede jacket in exactly the same color and I love it.
It's
Makes
joy.
me feel
That
very
is
happy. Yeah, very joyful.
such a good joy color.
Yeah.
Yeah. And everyone's version of their orange is going to be different, right? Some people will like something that's a little closer to peach, and some people will like something lighter, darker, whatever, brighter. But joy is orange. Orange is the color of joy. And every single one of our colors has a use, a purpose, a way that it can improve our health and well-being. So my number one tip for joy is to experiment with color. This is, again, what I'm putting in the book is that it is such an easy way to get a lot of the outcomes we're looking for without adding to our to-do list, without having to do the journal and the meditating and the things that we have to learn how to do. And it's hard. What I've seen with color, and this happened really organically in my agency as my clients started applying the branding stuff we were doing for their business to their own lives and seeing these incredible results, is that once you kind of learn about it, once your brain is sort of tuned into like, oh, I'm this personality type and this is my group of colors, you kind of can't unsee it. It's that like red pill, blue pill thing. And then your mind is just constantly processing like, which group is this color in? What about this one? And da 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 da, and creating
Mhm.
harmony and gonna go shopping and try on new stuff. And so it becomes this really beautiful, creative curiosity chase that brings a lot of joy and also wipes away a lot of anxiety. And then when you're surrounding yourself with these colors, your wardrobe, your office, your home, you're literally able to feed yourself with what you want and need, how you want to feel in those spaces based on that harmony that you're creating there. So that is my top tip.
So tell me, which color has nothing, no use?
Okay, so pretty much every color has positive psychological and negative psychological benefits, and we're including black and white in this, even though they're not technically colors, they're all colors and the absence of color. Gray. Gray is the color that has absolutely no positive psychological benefits.
Is that why we always feel a bit down when it's grey outside and it's been a long grey winter?
Exactly.
Because it was a long grey winter, wasn't it? And I can remember
It
thinking,
was.
I'm so sick of grey. Just give me some sunshine and some colour again. And now like the sun's beautiful today, beautiful blue sky, beautiful greenery on the trees because we're coming into spring and it's much, much better. That's really interesting. J.Nichole Smith, Nick, we're gonna have to leave it there. So thank you for joining me on the Business of Joy and Colour. Where can we follow you online? Get in touch for services with Joy First and for more information on Joy and Colour.
Great. Yeah. So you can find me at joyfirstworld.com. That's the website. You can find me on socials at J.Nichole Smith, and my name has an H in it. So it's the letter J, Nichole Smith.
Lovely. Nick, thank you once again and have a lovely day.
Thank you.